wolves in Colorado after the vote. Thank you for joining us if you're here on Zoom and letting us know where you're watching from. I want to do a land acknowledgement before we get started tonight and acknowledge with respect that I and our guest reside on the traditional lands of 48 Native American tribes who now live throughout the American Southwest, Great Plains, and Rocky Mountains, including the Southern Ute, the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Apache, the Comanche, and the Shoshone tribes. So if you've joined us for our series, as Nicole was saying here before we get started, in last fall, you will know that we put together 5 episodes leading up to the November ballot. Since that ballot initiative, we have decided to come back and bring you an epilogue episode where we're going to focus on what does this mean after the vote. We do have an audience joining us here on Zoom. We want to see your questions in the chat. We want to see where you're watching from too. So go ahead and open that up. Feel free to kind of keep that active. We've got eyes on that. And this is going to be a great conversation tonight. We're going to try to work in some of your questions along the way. I'm Kristen Eulenbrock. I work at the Institute for Science and Policy, a project of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And together with a various number of partners that I want to acknowledge and recognize, we've been bringing you this series, and we're really grateful for all of you for joining us today. So I do want to acknowledge and thank our partners in this, from the Colorado State University Warner College of Natural Resources, including the Center for Collaborative Conservation, the Center for Human-Carnivore Coexistence, and CSU Extension. And so with that, I want to welcome my co-host, for those of you who are also familiar, John Sanderson, who is the director of the Center for Collaborative Conversation. And him and I will be walking you through tonight's conversation with our guest speaker. Good evening, John. How are you doing?
Hey, Kristen, thanks so much. I'm doing great. Beautiful day here in Fort Collins, and thank you all for joining us. Tonight, as Kristen mentioned, we'll be talking about a question that was on your ballot this past November 3rd, Proposition 114, with the title Reintroduction and Management of Gray Wolves. So Proposition 114 requires Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission to develop a plan to reintroduce and manage gray wolves in Colorado and begin reintroduction by December 31st, 2023. Now, the commission is an 11-member citizen board appointed by the governor. The job of implementing the decisions of the commission falls to the state agency, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, also known as CPW. Our guest tonight is CPW Director Dan Prenzlow. Dan was born in Colorado, and those of us at Colorado State University are proud of the fact that Dan graduated from CSU with a bachelor's degree in wildlife biology in 1985. Dan was named director in May of 2019 after 33 years of experience with the agency, and he's worked in several parts of the state, pretty much all the state, I think we can say, and in a number of different roles. So he moved into his role as director with a vast amount of experience managing wildlife in Colorado, and we welcome him here tonight. Thanks for being here with us, Dan.
Yeah, thank you, John. I appreciate it. And Kristen, I appreciate the invite. And I know we've got an hour. I will chuckle for a second. So not only did I go to school in Fort Collins and a CSU alum, but I was born in Fort Collins, and then we lived in Virginia Dale at the base of Red Mountain, which I do believe CSU manages now as a property. So baptized there in the little church right along the road there at Livermore. So kind of grew up in that northern Colorado. So interesting kind of a trip back home. So.
Yeah, great. And it's a lovely place to be still all these years later. So Dan, I give a very brief high-level summary of Proposition 14. What does the law say? What are you expected to deliver as a result of this new law that we put into place back in November?
Well, we've kind of broken that down. Of course, we made sure we always had attorney help because it is a law now. It's once it's it's voted on in proposition. Once it's certified, then it's actually placed in Title 33 in my statutes. And so kind of make sure that we get that right. So I would say there's 6 major points, John, to what it requires the Parks and Wildlife Commission to do. First is to hold statewide hearings to acquire information to use in developing a plan. Secondly, to develop a plan to restore and manage wolves. 3, comply with Colorado Revised Statute 33-105.7 reporting requirements, which is before introduction, submit a report to the General Assembly. And 2, including whether introduction will impair existing uses of private land. 4th, take steps necessary to begin reintroduction of wolves, as you said, by 12/31 of 23. 4th, oversee wolf restoration and management, to include distribution of state funds made available to address wolf livestock conflicts. And 6th, periodically obtain public input to update the plan, so it's fresh and not gathering any dust.
Well, that sounds like a lot. Given those deliverables, and I know you all have been working on this plan for at least since the vote, probably before that as well. What are the main objectives you have now going forward to meet those deliverables?
Yeah, I appreciate that, John. Yeah, obviously we started before. We, fully at some level expected that it had a good possibility to pass. Actually, we had, I think, 4 scenarios prior to the vote: pass as a state species, pass as a federally listed species, don't pass as a federally listed species, and don't pass as a state species. So obviously it passed. And it was a federal species until January 6th, and then it's been delisted. And we can talk about that later, but there's been several lawsuits filed about relisting wolves. So, but currently it's a state species, not a federally endangered species. And that started actually, I believe, election day or the day after, and then it got certified January 6th of 2021. So back to the objectives. 4 of them really: gathering and sharing of information to build awareness and promote engagement across the state. 2, to design and implement an inclusive and transparent process to meet the requirements outlined in Proposition 114. Thirdly, to collaborate with technical experts and diverse stakeholders to share knowledge and draft management and conservation strategies. And 4th, to foster a commitment and collaboration toward plan implementation. Obviously, you can read between the lines. In my opinion, that's you can do this, but to do this well takes really everybody and a collective conversation. And you deal with the issues now, or you deal with them later. And I really do believe 114 requires that discussion now, not later.
Yeah, and I've heard from several folks that the biology and ecology of wolves is actually relatively straightforward, but the people side, I think, is the real complicated piece. But we'll get to all of that in a bit. So I've listened to, I don't know how many hours of commission hearings now, or commission meetings. There were 2 days back in January, and then there was another meeting just last Wednesday. Dozen hours or so of conversation about this, and lots of comments from the public. And so you all the commission has made some decisions and given you some direction. Can you share a bit about what that direction is at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, lots of discussion in January, and then as far as I'm concerned, they kind of put some meat on the bones of some of the plan in February. We had a 3-hour workshop and talked about a little bit of that detail. And so I'll get into some of that, and obviously we can talk about that for the rest of the hour. But the Parks and Wildlife Commission will serve as a decision-making body, for the implementation and development of this plan. This role will include 3 primary responsibilities. One, to consider options for public involvement and approve the public involvement process to develop the plan, which obviously that's what we worked on in January. To receive input from CPW staff, the public, stakeholders, and technical experts, and provide feedback on draft management plan concepts and strategies. So that's to come still. And 3, to approve the final plan. The Parks and Wildlife Commission will also monitor the process and the products throughout and provide feedback and guidance as necessary. It will be in the purview of the Parks and Wildlife Commission to either slow down or speed up the planning process as necessary. And that was a lot of discussion in the January meeting. Some of the detail, Parks and Wildlife Commission will convene 2 groups in consultation with Parks and Wildlife to support the management planning process. One will be a technical working group and one will be a stakeholder advisory group. It's important to note that we propose these groups be advisory bodies to the Parks and Wildlife Commission. Parks and Wildlife Commission is the deciding body. The advisory groups obviously are not decision making. The technical working group with CPW staff as well as other state and federal experts will convene to provide objective, scientific-based information to inform the development of the plan. The technical work group will propose conservation objectives and management strategies that CPW will incorporate into the draft plan. Kind of the who, what, when, and where, damage prevention, compensation program, etc. The technical work group will share information with the stakeholder advisory group, which I'll talk about next, throughout the planning process, including the development of a draft management strategies and actions for stakeholder review. The director, myself, CPW director, in consultation with the Parks and Wildlife Commission, will approve members of the technical working group. Member representation may include CPW, of course, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USDA, Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, USDA Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Colorado Department of Agriculture, National Park Service, tribal representation, other state or federal agency representation is deemed appropriate. And there was a discussion, and the commission in February chose not to do ex officio non-voting of Parks and Wildlife commissioners, since all the commission would hear everything. So those will be public meetings, of course. So that's the technical working group. Stakeholder advisory group will be a broad range of interest in wolves and wolf management and conservation. Will be convened to support the development of a draft strategies to provide consensus recommendations to CPW with dissenting views captured. The technical working group will be responsible for the content of the plan, while the stakeholder advisory group will be providing opportunities to make substantive contributions for consideration. Where the stakeholder advisory group is able to achieve consensus on conservation objectives or management strategies, their input will receive priority consideration. Again, the CPW director, in consultation with the Parks and Wildlife Commission, will approve appointments to the stakeholder advisory group following an application and review process coordinated by CPW. The external facilitator, which we will talk about here in a minute, John maybe, will have a role coordinating this process. CPW will seek a diverse and inclusive membership that is balanced between interest areas. Member representation may include stakeholders representing wolf advocacy groups, livestock producers, representatives of local and county government, members at large, representatives of general citizens, representative environmental interest, sports persons, academia and cooperative extension, Parks and Wildlife Commission, which again, we talked about and decided that they would not be part of that. Executive Director of DNR or their designee as an ex officio, non-voting. The Director of Parks and Wildlife, me, or their designee Again, ex officio, non-voting, Commissioner of Agricultural, or their designee, ex officio, non-voting. It is recommended that this group be no more than really 14 or 15 individuals if possible, so they can work effectively. We also feel that this group should have inclusive representation from diverse backgrounds, perspectives, and geographic regions in Colorado, familiarity or interest in wolf management and conservation. Diverse wolf management interest, conservation, advocacy, education, hunting, trapping, recreation, livestock, socioeconomic, etc. Won't be just biological, obviously. And I think that's it on that. I did touch base, and then I'll take a break. Did touch base with a professional facilitator. We did go out with a request for proposal that is on the street as of a couple days before, so about a week ago, maybe last Monday. We are proposing that we have that external facilitator will be contracted to run the stakeholder advisory group and the technical work group, help hold statewide hearings and other engagement forums and public comment opportunities in coordination with my staff. This will be key position our plan to ultimate success of this planning process. And of course, my staff will be involved, general public will be involved. That's kind of the nutshell of those two groups and the current plan.
That's great. Dan and John, if I may, I think we want to kind of unpack a lot of that, including we're seeing a lot of audience engagement, curious about the makeup of the groups and everything, which we'll get to. But I actually want us to take a little bit bigger picture view before we kind of head down this road into some of the specifics in more detail and ask you, Dan, about CPW's role in wolves, in the fact that this is a very, let's say, public issue. And we've heard that, CPW has received a tremendous amount of comments regarding the reintroduction of wolves. Why are wolves different than other species that CPW and other wildlife? Why are they different? And why do you think there's so much public interest in this topic?
That's a good question. I think I spend nights not sleeping about that. Because my inbox is full every day from every opinion in the world, from every direction on wolves in the world. And I'm not a philosopher. I am a biologist from CSU and have a lot of management experience. And the best I can tell you, it's an apex, obviously it's an apex predator. They're a generalist species, so whether they're on the endangered species list or not, they thrive where they're at. If you give them, they have food and space, they'll find a living. But I can't think of any animal. If you look back, they're in the Bible, they're Little Red Riding Hood. Someone said it was written in 1600, but it was a folklore from the 1200s or something. I don't know if that's true or not. I've not had time to Google that, answering all the emails I've got. But I think at the end of the day, wolves do impact the landscape. They are part of the natural landscape, but if you're a livestock producer, or if you're somebody walking, a dog on a trail, wolf will impact your life. And so there's just lots of different opinions about that. There's a connectivity for some people that the ecosystem's not in balance if you don't have wolves, and the other side of that is the world's not going to be well if there are wolves on the landscape because they impact your livelihood. And so I think somewhere in between that is probably really the truth, but that that's what we've been told we get to do in Proposition 114.
And Dan, I'd love to unpack the technical working group and the stakeholder advisory group a little bit as well, because we've gotten quite a few questions already about who sits on those groups, how they will be selected, and so forth. And I know that's been a big part of the commission meetings in the last couple of months. But I'd love your thoughts on, just to begin with, at the very highest level, what's at stake for Colorado here? I heard Reed DeWalt during one of the commission meetings, I don't know if it was last week or in January, describe this as one of the biggest conservation actions in North America going on right now. And it really feels like there's a lot at stake that we're hearing in these commission meetings from people who really want to see wolves on the landscape and those who really do not. But what's at stake for Colorado?
Well, that's a good, I'll say when that's a good question, but that's a good question. I think multi-layered, John, maybe I'll try and get not off track. So really I think what's at stake. So for me, as I talked about it before, is that it's a requirement for me. It's the law. I'm going to implement that. But for anybody else, that's not a job requirement. If you're a livestock producer, you're worried about your bottom line. If you believe, wolves are the epitome of the most important thing that on the landscape, you can't imagine why we haven't done this prior. And so I think what's at stake for Colorado is that if not done well, and I'll get back to this, if not done well, and process matters in this one. If I was bringing on a species that really didn't impact many people and it was really a feel-good kind of thing, I think process always matters, but it's less important. But this one, not done well, we'll spend the rest of our lives or years and years really arguing over that was a poor decision or we've got done to us. And I think back to your original question, wolves up to this date have been moved in. There's some that have gotten here naturally, but any that were moved in the lower 48 states were done under the auspices of the Endangered Species Act. And there was not a lot, matter of fact, there's quite, I hate to say that, but there wasn't very much collaboration with the states or anybody in that when that happened under the Endangered Species Act. There was some, I'm not an expert in that, someone I'm sure will tell me, all the collaboration that did go on, but that was a decision by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under the Endangered Species Act. So Colorado is unique in that even though this was a decision by the voters, it's not by the Endangered Species Act or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, although they are partners in this. And so Colorado's very unique in this. Our neighboring states are paying attention to this. Our neighboring states are paying attention to this for a lot of different details, whether it's a northern gray wolf or a Mexican wolf. Let me tell you, the neighboring states are very interested and apprehensive of what Colorado is doing. And so that's the one part. I think the second part, I'll go back to process. Actually, somebody much wiser than me said that whether this is good news or bad news for you, the wolf reintroduction or restoration, but if you break somebody's process and they feel left behind, they go from thinking that's bad news to really kind of seeking revenge. And I think if we don't do this well, which really the language tells us how to do this, and we're very sincere about that on the landscape, who will pay? The wolves will actually pay the price of that if we don't do this well. And the people of Colorado will pay if we don't do this well at some level. And that's why if you look at the language, there's language about not creating land use issues, having a robust process. All those parts that I talked about before are really designed about trying to get some kind of, I guess my word is sense of fairness and sense of discussion, even if it doesn't go your way or does go your way. And we are doing our best not to relitigate this discussion at all. The vote happened, the vote passed, it's a law, and I'm going to implement it, and I'm going to implement as best I can. But I can do that haphazardly, or I can ignore people, or I can do the best I can. And I think, and that's not a platitude, you either deal with it now or you deal with it later. And I think this language and this commission that took a vote is they're going to deal with that the best of their ability now prior, to actually taking action. So I think that's Colorado's at stake. There's lots of concern or question about wolves being re-endangered. I think 8 of the last 9 times the wolves were tried to be delisted, somebody filed suit and they were flipped. And so there's a high likelihood that wolves will be re-endangered again right in the middle of this process, and that affects Colorado. And so we're trying to be mindful of that. That's one of the reasons we're working to partner with our partners at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, because in theory I'm in charge now and they may be in charge a year from now, and then I might be in charge a year after that. And so if you don't understand that there's a political football in here too, I think you would be naive.
Well, I appreciate all those dynamics, Dan. There's a lot there that we could talk on all night, I feel like. But I do want to pick up on a thread here that's pretty active in the chat, and just have you maybe provide some insight that about this process piece, which is there's both the technical advisory group and the stakeholder group, working groups, and I'm probably not saying the exact name right. So there's questions about how do people get involved, how do people get selected, both through the stakeholder group. And then for the technical group, you had listed a number of agency kind of requisites of who would serve on that. And there was a question about other scientific and technical expertise regarding wolf restoration that isn't tied to an agency. So could you talk about both those groups a little bit, and who gets selected and what is that process going to look like?
Yeah, okay, perfect. So this week we'll actually come out and we'll put it on our website. We'll run a press release too. We'll come out with a full out application to be on the stakeholder advisory group. And like I said, there's no names in there. We're not married to the whatever 12 or 15 kind of categories in there. And part of that is none of that's predetermined. You may have a person that can fill 2 slots. We'd like to keep, or 3 slots maybe. Maybe somebody's a county commissioner in their past life and now they're a legislator. Well, maybe that's 2 slots that you'd fill, and so you didn't have to have 2 people. You can have one that could represent, that, not that constituency, but that knowledge base. And so, but anyway, there will be an application. I should have it in front of me here, but I'm buried under my paperwork. We'll have a turnaround time, maybe 2-3 weeks. There'll be a vetting process. Again, Parks and Wildlife Commission and myself. That'll be about on your experience and what you can bring to the table. We'll look for people that can work together in a group. Now we expect people, if you look at that, there's going to be 15 different opinions or 20 different opinions, and there'll be pro-wolf and anti-wolf and whatever you want. But the idea will be that we work on consensus to make the best decision or recommendations we can to my staff who's writing the plan. So that is the application process. I'll take a side note. I was part of the wolf working group. I saw Rob Edwards' name pop up. He was part of that in 2004. Collaborative processes do work, and you do find common ground. May not start out that way, but it ends that way if you do it well. The technical group is really the experts in their field. Now, this might hurt some people's feelings, whether they're on the call or not, but very few people would be technical experts, including me, on wolf and wolf biology and wolf restoration and damage. And so we've had this discussion is that if you, like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is a good example. There's a couple people in the Rocky Mountain region with wolf expertise that Fish and Wildlife Service. So we're probably not going to have somebody from Massachusetts from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They won't make the meetings. And so we're not really looking for hundreds of applications on the technical advisory group. What we will do is if people believe they can fill one of those slots to send an email to my staff, it won't be a full application because most of the technical advisory group, again, will be experts in their field in those areas that we looked at. We just don't want to overlook anybody in this because this will be the real technical experts, and they will inform again, my staff as they're writing that plan and the commission. So that will come out together. So one will be an application and one will be, if you think you have a role in that technical advisory group, please send us an email and we'll take it under consideration.
Thank you.
So Dan, I also know from the commission meetings that you all have been consulting with fish and wildlife agencies across the Rockies. There are some 2,000 plus wolves now north of us and west of us, gray wolves, and other states have been managing this process and working with wolves or having wolves on the landscape for a couple decades now plus. What would you say are the most important lessons that you've heard from those other agencies? And I'm curious about lessons around stakeholder engagement, but I'm also curious about lessons as it relates to the biological and ecological dimensions of the wolves as well.
Couple stage, I'll answer that in a couple stages, I think. And this is where if I had my staff in there, they'd give me more detail than I have on that. But so we have reached out to all of our neighboring states, or northern states that have wolves, and we've reached out to the greater upper Midwest too, where Wisconsin and Minnesota, they're updating their plans. And you know, interestingly, first, which is not up, it's not up to me, that's what the law requires, is that every state said if tackling what you're tackling, you should, there's no way you'll get it done between 3 and 5 years if you were starting with that. So that didn't spook me because I have no alternative to do differently. It just tells you that it's a tough to pull off and it's complicated and everybody has an opinion on how it ought to be. You can't do it in a vacuum and you can't do it quickly. I think that struck me. I think the other thing that probably struck me is that a couple things. It said wolves never quit asking for your time. And I think that what I'm gonna read into that, I have no expertise in that, at least in Colorado, but when they're on the landscape, and whether it's a effect on ungulates or effect on livestock or people's land use issues, or they're in the people's neighborhoods or whatever it's going to be, or will it impact me, that the wolves on the landscape it's just a higher tenor, I guess. It would be lots of questions, lots of concern. So my staff is just always going to be answering questions. We do that now. But to think that 5 years from now, every question will be resolved about wolves would not be accurate. We answer questions every day about what do I do about mountain lions in my neighborhood, or coyotes, or prairie dogs in my window well. So wolves is just a higher tenor, higher explanation. So I think that's, we're not staffed up to handle that yet, and so that's okay. We don't need a bunch of staff sitting there just think tanking yet, but the damage will be, we'll have damage issues. We'll have safety concerns. We'll have to answer those, whether they're real or perceived. And so I think those other states have said it's a bigger nut to crack than it is. Like you mentioned earlier, John, the biology of wolves really is pretty simple. It's the socioeconomic, political processes and how it impacts people that are not so simple. So I think those are a couple. I'm sure there's a bunch more of that. Collaring is one. We don't have an answer to this. Some people, radio collars, some people say, be careful what you collar, because everybody, will want to collar on every pack of wolves so they can monitor and know everything that's going on. Other people, like, once you start that, you can never get away from that because people have an interest, and I get it, right? I want to know. My analogy would be, it's not the same analogy, it struck me when we when we did a study on mountain lions in around the Front Range, we had that real robust discussion internally of, should we really turn those, satellite collars? Before it was VHS, and you would never get a reading unless you're in the airplane once a week. But when you get to GPS collars, you can download it every minute if you'd like to on that location of that animal. And the batteries don't last very long when you do that. You kill your battery life. But my point being, John, that when you have lions, we had lions that wander into schoolyards, people's backyards, commercial sites in the middle of the night. What's the obligation to inform the public of that? Because those are the ones you know about. What about the ones you don't know about? And so there's really robust discussions about how much you really can or should share. That information is really not public anyway, but you got to be careful how much information you want, because it can get right close and personal if a lion's in your backyard, while you're in your jacuzzi. So
we're going to have to spend a little bit of time talking about budgeting for some of this, because that's coming up. But before we get to that, let me ask you, Dan, about the schedule, right? And so the law states that by December 2023 is when plans should be in place, and we should have rules being reintroduced to Colorado. And then the governor has made a request or suggestion about 2022. Where are we? What's this deadline? What is this going to look like from a timing perspective?
Well, we know the latest we can do that. And so there was a fair amount of discussion at the commission meeting. And obviously the governor came on, encouraged us to do a robust process, but move it along. The commission took a lot of discussion about that. The law is very specific about 12/23, 12/31 of 23. And so where they ended, we have to do, the plan needs to be a little done prior to moving rules. And so I don't think, and they did, commission agreed that we would plan to have rules on the landscape by 12/23. So that would necessitate the plan be done a little earlier. But we have all we have all the requirements we need to get done. And so even the first line of those 6 points talked about that you have to, commission must hold meetings around the state to develop the plan. There was lots of discussion about that. There still is. Should we draft a plan and then take that out? Well, if you read that literally, it says commission shall hold meetings and then develop a plan. Now, does that have to be in person? No, it doesn't. But COVID is COVID. And there's a big sense from really every direction that when you have meetings, it really shouldn't be only Zoom platform. There's a lot of discussion that you need to have some platform in Zoom because people are worried about, their safety. But a lot of people want to have that discussion in person, and the commission is very sensitive to that. So long-winded answer, Kristen, is that we will get it done by the due date. If we can get it done earlier and hit all those milestones and get it done well, so be it. Glad to do that. So we'll see that. There's parts that we are not, we can't completely control, and that will be, we are discussing with our partners at Fish and Wildlife Service about 10J rules, and you hear a lot about that at commission meeting. That's a rule with under the Endangered Species Act that would address some of that land use language. And so we're not in control of all that, but they're fully aware that we'd like to move that along and have already asked about starting those processes now. You do need a draft plan to, for them to react to, in all fairness. So they can't just say, oh, that's a great idea, so we've got to have a draft plan to work on that. So that's my short answer of a long-winded question. So, or long-winded answer.
And Dan, can I ask a specific thing in here that's come up a couple of times from people who are on the phone with us, has to do with the time. And honestly, I'm not entirely clear when I read Proposition 114 on this, because I think it's a little bit vague, because it kind of says, we should have a plan by December 31st, 2023, but then also wolves should be reintroduced by 2023. Can you clarify that for us, that particular timing between planning and actually opening the doors of the cages and releasing wolves on the ground?
Well, there's a loaded question in that, John. I know you didn't just try and throw me under the bus, but you just did. But I'm doing it with a smile because it's, it is a fair question. And so this is no difference to all my lawyer friends, but I'm not a lawyer. I don't want to be a lawyer. Glad I'm not a lawyer. But here's the lawyer talk in me that I don't have. You can make an argument. That's what lawyers say. You can make an argument for both of those. I read Proposition 114, and it says we need to have a plan by 12/31 of 23. I can promise you the proponents and the people that wrote that believe that that meant that there are wolves on the landscape by that date. But it doesn't say that, it says a plan. What the commission did, so I read a plan, but what the commission did, and part of that was that I think fully looking at the intent of that is that they would have wolves on the landscape by 12 of 23. That was a big movement because you could look differently. And the commission could have said, yep, it's just a plan. And somewhat, it's not semantics, then say, okay, the plan's done by December of 23, by January of 24, which is a month later, I could be moving wolves. And so we just tried to stay out of that mire pit and said, look, we'll try and have we'll have a plan done and be moving wolves at the latest of 12 to 23. But we chose to just try and, as best we could, stay away from the you can make an argument, lawyer talk. So, but you're right, it's not as clear as it could have been, my opinion.
Thank you.
What about funding? How is this management of wolves going to be funded?
That's a great question. So if nothing happens that's additional, if you peel the onion back, the law states that about state funds and game cash funds, and when it talks about state funds, it's probably talking about general fund taxpayer dollars, but we don't get general funds. We're self-funded. There's some real rare instances. So again, great question. If nothing happens, I pay the bill. But it does contemplate, it's a vote of the people. And so what I would tell you is it's important, the color of money and who pays for decisions really does matter. And so if it's today, if we don't get additional funding, I would say sportsmen and women's dollars are getting used on something that really wasn't their idea. And quite frankly, most, but not all, weren't overly supportive of that bill. And so there's a real robust discussion. Matter of fact, there's a bill in the legislature right now, and it's supported, my understanding is, by wolf proponents and wolf opponents to find general fund dollars to fund the next 5 years of this, the restoration and the planning and the damage, I would add, if and there is any damage. We do have some wolves on the landscape today, and we are liable for that damage. I don't think it'll be significant. We only have a few wolves on the landscape, but they're don't know what tomorrow holds. So that question in the legislature is a really good question. I think it's important. This is a vote of the people, but to have to take money from the whether it's hunters or anglers or other pots of federal aid to do what the voters voted for. There's a robust discussion about coming up with general funds, since it was a vote of the people. And that, last but not least on that, we think it's about, with facilitation and with, if there's staff, meetings, obviously moving wolves, it's not free to move wolves when we get to that point. It's about $1 million a year for 5 years, so about $5 million. And so there is discussion again on a bill like that. Ultimately, we hope that that's funded. We do have support of the governor's office in that, and we hope that gets funded, and whether we put it in a bank account and we don't have to have this conversation again, for the next 5 years, and we can do our job like we're expected to do.
Dan, before I would love to get to compensation programs and all of the dimensions of that are mentioned in 114, but before we get there, I'd love to ask you a little bit about the role of science in this whole process. And, leading up to the vote, there were, a variety of views expressed about the role of science. I mean, not the role of science, but what is true, right? And I'm curious, within the technical advisory group, what are you thinking about how you will grapple with the science and make sure that there's a clear understanding of what existing science there is, but then also, perhaps even more important, going forward past December of 2023, how do we work to create good science that everyone can accept and believe in, or at least a majority of us can accept and believe in it? And that science could be around, impacts on cattle, could be around impacts on elk, trophic cascades, which has been a big focus of the wolves up in Yellowstone. How do we deal with that science going forward? What do you think that might look like for both the agency and other partners at universities and other agencies?
Very broad. Well, it's a great question, broad question. I'm not sure I'll unpack all that in the time, but keep me on track, or if I miss some of that. So I think even in 114 it talks about, if it didn't, it should have. I think it does talk about science-based management. The second part of that is it has to be continually refreshed. So that's part of that science. If there's new science out there, additive science, that when we do the plan, you would add to that on science-based. Parks and Wildlife has been doing science-based wildlife management for 123 years. So that's not a shock to us. And you want to start there. So it's not purely a science decision, right? It says back to that, there's impact, socioeconomic, et cetera. But you got to start with science and biology. And obviously people will agree or disagree on some scientific levels. And that's part of the discussion. That's part of the reason you have a technical group and a stakeholder advisory group. And let's concentrate a little more on the technical group. There's some really hard science about certain things. Wolves, again, generalist species, they'll do pretty well if they have food in space. You get to depredation, as you kind of started out that question, or game damage per se. There's wolves will impact livestock owners. That's pretty simple. I'm not sure that's a science base. Eat a calf, they eat a calf. That's not simple emotionally for the rancher. I don't want to dispel that, but that specific damage is pretty easy to quantify if you can find about it. What's less easy quantifiable is pregnancy rate different, or is there worry loss or abortion rate of domestic livestock? And I have no expertise in that. We'll obviously have to bring people to that technical advisory group or to the commission to unpack that. And I think the science, my understanding, there's some decent science about preventive measures, very good science in not only in the US, but in Europe, and a fair amount of science in Europe about that larger scale of conception rate, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm no expert in that. I'm a wildlife manager, although I got a minor in range at CSU, but range is not my expertise. So the other thing I'd add to that, we'll have a lot of science discussions about that, and we'll manage to the best science that we believe fits Colorado's plan, and that's why we'll have different views on that. The other thing that we're going to do in the next few months with the commission, and this will be open, obviously, to the public. Everything is on the public record, so everybody gets to see what we're working on. No secrets in this plan. Is that working on some education kind of vignettes, for lack of a better term. I don't know if that's probably not the right word, but a couple hour sessions. We don't expect the commissioner or all our staff or the public to be wolf experts. That's a lifelong thing, but let's base on reality and not perception, and things that have been learned or known about wolves in the Northern Rockies. And so we think that's, the biological, the damage, the how to manage, the interaction with humans. And so we envision that kind of throughout, but we're going to start some education sessions that really start again, John, with what's the current science? What's the reality, not what people's perception is.
Thank you. And one follow-up, when thinking about science, in the wildlife management context, we're usually thinking about the sorts of things we've been discussing for the past few minutes around the wolf biology and ecology and the ecology of riparian ecosystems. And yet in recent decades, we've also learned, as you yourself said earlier, that perhaps even the bigger piece of the challenge here is the social challenge. And the vote did show, just purely numbers wise, the urban-rural divide that we hear about. And I personally hold the view that, for the future of Colorado, we should be working to close that divide. What are you thinking of, or what are your staff thinking perhaps about how we bring social science to understanding how we bring Colorado to more together around this contentious issue rather than it being another divider?
Yeah, well, back to that, process matters, and if there's any subject that process matters most, this would be it. And so, in a perfect world, we might have, more process and more time and more discussion, but we have a finite time limit, and that's okay. We'll get that done. And you always have a finite budget, right? Whether we get help funded or not. So we'll get this done on budget and on time. But do our best to bring everybody along. So two points, back to hard science. There's some really kind of defined hard science. There's some things, and I'm not trying to be the scientist here, but there's some things that aren't resolved, and it depends on who you talk to. Chronic wasting disease is a good example, right? The science of whether wolves will really help with that or not help with that, or it'll be a slam dunk help with that, or just a minor help with that. There's not a ton of science on there. We think there will be, and maybe partnership with CSU will answer that question eventually, but it's not answered today. And if anybody has that, feel free to send it to me, but it won't, my understanding is it won't be answered. We can talk about trophic cascade, and no question in Yellowstone that when the elk, there's less elk on the landscape, willows started to come back, aspen started to reform. That's a fact. It's also, there's a lot more bison there now, and then bison are starting to impact willows. So is that a complete success or failure? Not for me to decide. I don't think it's ever that black and white. You know that from a scientific aspect, John, and so wolves, we don't know exactly what impact wolves will have to Colorado, because they haven't been here since the 1940s, and even prior to that, they were in low numbers. So with 6 million people on the landscape and 70 years or 100 years of non-wolves, I'm pretty sure we have some curveballs coming for all of us. And so we'll get to figure out the science as we go together in that. So second part of that urban-rural divide, I must say, the vote was close. There's no relitigation on my part. I know what my job entails for me to pull this off, but not everybody voted for. It was really specific. It was very, even in the Front Range, which carried the vote, it was 60-40, not 80-20, and it was 80-20 against for the most part on the the east slope and the west slope. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do, and it really all falls on the Parks and Wildlife Commission. That's not a woe is me, that's just the language of the bill. And so Parks and Wildlife Commission is very plugged in on back to that process, that as best they can, they're going to be very open and listen to people's thoughts, concerns, scientific, not opinions, scientific facts, and some facts that are not so scientific, but people want to believe that they're science because, you know, somebody published them in a, you know, in a one-page article that's not peer reviewed. And there, you know, there's a lot of those discussions the commission's going to have, you know, going to have to listen to and weigh in on.
So I want to build on this just a little bit more into a slightly different direction though, Dan, and we are wrapping up here close in 5 minutes, but when we think about the engaged stakeholders that are currently involved and showing up and really engaged in this process, what is your thoughts and ideas around how do you engage maybe underrepresented or not historically included voices to this conversation, or perhaps including both traditional sources of knowledge, ecological knowledge? I'm thinking from our Native American communities and Indian tribes. What is your process for including often voices that are not often the most vocal and at the table, quote unquote?
Yeah, so again, that's the question du jour right now. So we're going to absolutely have already done reaching out to our 2 sovereign nation tribes here in Colorado, and they are invited to participate in this. It will be an impact to them, and quite frankly, again, they're the sovereign nation, so they get to say what happens on their land completely. The other underrepresented groups, we do have an eye to diversity. Diversity is not mine to define in this, but there's many different levels of diverse, and we think it's back to the stakeholder process, even less so the technical advisory group, because those are experts in their field. But the stakeholder advisory group is that if we don't, again, represent all of Colorado, you pay now or pay later. And so we're really trying to be very mindful about having really as much as we can, every voice in Colorado. And there was discussion on the commission meeting about paying, you know, travel expenses or even stipends. And I know when we did the 2004 plan, which by the way, we've dusted that off and we'll bring that forward as any parts that were already on consensus, no reason to reinvent the wheel. If I recall, you know, we paid for travel and expenses for people because, you know, I may get paid to do what I'm doing now, maybe not, but since all the hours I'm working, but, you know, not everybody gets paid to talk about wolves and a stakeholder. So we want to make sure that we provide enough opportunity that we have all those voices represented as best we can. So we also are mindful we can't have 200 people in a working group. So,
Dan, I appreciate that. And I want to say thank you for joining us this evening. As many of you who joined us tonight probably realize, you know, we did not have CPW on leading up to the vote, didn't have that perspective. And so now this quote unquote ball has fallen into their court to manage. And so I'm very grateful, Dan, that you were able to join us this evening. Let us know what you're thinking, what the plans are, where we are in the process, and the road ahead. There is a number of resources that we have available. I'm assuming many people already on here are attuned to your mailing list and eager to follow along, but we will share additional resources. Nicole's already got them in the chat there for people to find out more information and if they really want to stay engaged in the process moving forward. So Dan, thank you for joining us this evening.
absolutely, and it was my pleasure. Like I said, I hope looks like from the chat, not everybody enjoyed it, but at least some, and hopefully most found it informative. And like I said, we'll get there in the end. So I appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you, Dan. And we really appreciate everyone who's spent the last hour with us. Thank you for showing up and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone. Keep in touch. And a huge thank you to our partners all up at CSU for helping us put this together. For those who are still staying on, I'm going to make a quick plug. John and I and a number of others are putting together a forest and wildfire and people, all the intersection between the through, another mini series coming up starting later this month in March. So make sure you keep your eye out for that, and hopefully you'll help us approach that topic like we did with wolves, where we brought in a lot of perspectives to explore the challenges of wildfires here in Colorado and the West. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you again. Hope you enjoy your evening.